This program is brought to you by Stanford on iTunes U at Stanford University. Please visit us at itunes.stanford.edu.
I was going to start by, I don't know how many of you have seen these slides before, but by showing what has been come to know as the MAP slides. Has anybody seen these? These are from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and these are based on phone interviews of the United States population, and they give rates based on self-reported heights and weights. They give rates of obesity defined as a body mass index greater than 30, which is the height over the square of the weight measured in kilograms and meters, although it can be done in pounds and in inches as well. And that's about 30 pounds overweight for, as you see, for a 5'4" person. It changes based on your height, of course. And what you see here is the distribution starting in 1985 by state of the proportion of people who met this criteria for obesity. And I'm just going to run through these so you can see why we're calling this an epidemic. And this is just of adults. This is 1985, 1986, 1987, 1988, 1989, 1990, 1991, 1992, 1993, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 2000, 2001, and 2002. And what you can see is this has really been a tremendously dramatic change in the proportion of our U.S. population, of adult population, that is considered obese by these measures of height and weight. And it's really changed at a rate that is beyond almost anything that we're used to seeing in terms of epidemics or diseases, other than some of the infectious disease outbreaks, but it's occurred across the United States. And you can see at a minimum, there's no state left that has less than 15% of its adult population that is defined this way. The other thing to note is this is really an underestimate, because these are self-reported heights and weights, and people tend to overestimate their height and underestimate their weight when asked about it. So these are underestimates, and you can see already we have some states back in 2002 that are above 25% of their population. In children, we don't use that body mass index of 30 to define obesity or 25 to define overweight. We use these standards that have developed from our national surveys that were done from the 1960s through the 1980s. These growth curves are created from that because after that point it was felt that the population of kids was getting heavier than was healthy for them, and so those are our standards. So when you go to a pediatrician's office or a family physician's office and your child or grandchild is plotted on the growth charts, this is what they look like. This is for girls, and this is a body mass index chart. Again, the weight in kilograms divided by the square of the height in meters is how we calculate it. And if you end up above this, at the top end of these curves, above the 95th percentile, you're defined as overweight as a child for your age and your sex. So there's no one number that we can use to categorize children because they're growing and we expect them to get heavier as they grow, and they actually put on body mass as they grow. So it depends upon their age and their sex. Now, using this as a standard, if we want to look at how obesity or overweight has changed in children across the country, and we call it overweight in children at this point, although there's consideration being to go back to calling it obesity, but it truly is overweight because it's measured with, it's based upon definitions of height and weight, not based upon specific measures of body fat, although they're highly correlated with each other. And what we can see is that if you look back, and as you would expect, because the standards are based on the 60s through 1980, you see that about 5%, and that's the yellow, green, and the orange, yellow, and green bars are the 1960s through 1980 surveys. Sorry, the orange and yellow bars on here. You can see that about 5% of children would be defined as over the 95th percentile, because that makes sense, right? 5% over the 95th percentile. What's happening, because we froze the charts at that point, or we froze the standards at that point, what you see is now more than 5% of the population is above the 95th percentile. So that's how you can end up with more than 5% overweight. And what you see is since the 1980, we've seen a doubling to a tripling of the rate of overweight in children across the country. So a lot more of our kids are actually over that 95th percentile as defined on the growth charts. Now, we've done a number of surveys here in the Bay Area. We do a lot of school-based studies, and we find that we haven't seen a population recently that's had less than about 20 to 25% of the sample over the 95th percentile. And so we're seeing it rise even faster. And these bars that I put up are just projections for this year based upon what the acceleration has been in the past. But we're seeing even greater rates than this in our diverse population in the Bay Area. Now, this isn't just a cosmetic problem for kids, although for a long time people assumed that being overweight was mainly a health problem for adults and not for kids, but there are actually health problems associated with it, even in childhood. The main ones are on the left side here, and those are high cholesterol, hypercholesterolemia, often a low HDL cholesterol, which is the good cholesterol, a high triglyceride level, which is another way that fats are carried in the blood and can be associated with heart disease risk, high blood pressure, hypertension, hyperinsulinemia, or a high insulin level, which is almost a pre-diabetic state in children. And in fact, we do see now type 2 diabetes from high insulin levels and low ability for the body to utilize insulin, now starting as early as adolescence. Something that used to be called adult onset diabetes, and now we can't really call it that anymore because we're starting to see it in teenagers. Fatty liver, or non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, NASH is what it's being called, is where you actually get fat infiltrating the liver. So over time, it actually turns into a problem that is almost indistinguishable from alcoholic cirrhosis, where you actually can get terrible liver disease from just having the fat take over parts of the liver and destruction of the liver tissue. We're starting to see this in probably 10 to 15% of the overweight children we see in our clinics. Then there's real stigmatization and prejudice that occurs against people based on their weight, and there's a lot of documentation of that. In kids, we usually talk about kids being teased at school or on the playground, but it's much more pervasive than that in terms of the way teachers treat them and their expectations for their performance in athletics or in school and other things. And there's pretty good documentation that as a society we do discriminate against overweight people. And there are many, in addition to the stigmatization and prejudice, there are many other social, emotional, and economic costs associated with children who are overweight or who carry that weight into adulthood, and to society itself. In fact, the current estimate for the cost of obesity to our country is in excess of $100 billion a year. So just an astounding cost, and that's just the start, because we're just starting to see these chronic diseases associated with overweight starting to creep into teenagers and much more as they become young adults. And so we have a lot of these other problems that are going to end up being epidemics of their own. On the right hand of the slide, I gave you a list of other problems that we see too, and they range throughout the entire body: orthopedic problems, neurological problems. Pseudotumor cerebri is something we see where we have increased pressure in the brain that we don't know what causes it, but is more common among overweight kids. respiratory or pulmonary lung problems, gastrointestinal problems with more gallstones, especially in adolescent girls, although we really don't know what the rate is. We know it's more common in women who are overweight, but at this point we don't have good studies of teenagers. Endocrinological problems, polycystic ovary disease, and type 2 diabetes that I mentioned. Psychological problems associated with overweight. Of course, eating disorders are of high prevalence rate in overweight, especially girls, but boys as well, where they're using unhealthful methods to try and control their weight. And depressive symptoms tend to be higher, especially in clinical samples. What's interesting is we don't necessarily see increased depression in the community among overweight kids. When you're looking at school kids or a school as a whole, you don't see much of a relationship between their weight and how depressed they are, or depressive symptoms. But when you see the people who don't come seek treatment, there tends to be a much higher rate of these problems than we would see in children who were not overweight. So what's causing obesity and what's causing this epidemic? Well, it's an energy imbalance, of course, and everyone seems to know that. And where there's a balance, and if you take in more energy or more calories than you burn, your weight's going to go up. If you burn more calories than you take in, your weight's going to go down. It's sort of simple thermodynamics. And we hear a lot about genes that may regulate that, and especially we have a lot of work going on here at Stanford and other universities trying to identify genetic and metabolic problems that are associated with weight gain. Well, in fact, it may be that a majority of us have genes that make us more susceptible to weight gain. I mean, we know that over 2/3 of American adults are overweight, so pretty much everybody's at risk. But the problem is those genes really only express themselves or only manifest in our weight problems, or what we've seen in this population, when we're in the right environment, such that our behaviors tend to increase what we take in, or decrease the activity we perform, or increase the amount of time we spend in sedentary behavior, or all of the above. And only in those circumstances or in that environment do these genes create this problem where we have so much of our population at risk of overweight and overweight already. There's no way that the genes can account for the rapid increases we've seen over the last several decades, because our genes don't really change that. So it's really how they are genes which are protective, keeping our weight for probably evolved over a long period of time, hundreds of millions of years, I guess, is how that responds to an environment which we really have a lot of opportunities to overeat and to not be active and to be sedentary. I like to show this slide of a famous painting, La Familia by Botero, and because it sort of shows that this is a family issue, that the whole family often shares their weight problems. And it's not always the case. You sometimes have a thin child with a heavy child, or parents and stuff, but it tends to be something that families have to deal with. And that's both the genes and the environment, the family environment and their behaviors. And in fact, one of the nice things about this painting is you see the pet dog down there, and the dog is also overweight too. And we know that actually when that pet weight is associated with owner weight. There are people who have actually studied that, believe it or not. And so the pet is exposed to the same environment as the rest of the family, even though they don't share the genes. Okay, now I'm going to take you back even further, although probably hasn't been a lot of evolution in our genes since then, but about 800 years ago, a little more than 800 years ago, and a famous physician and philosopher named Maimonides, and he wrote this quote. He said, "Obesity is harmful to the body and makes it sluggish, disturbs its functions, and hinders its movements. Therefore, extremely obese individuals should travel to the seashore, do much walking in the sun, and especially bathe in the sea in order to lose weight. Their nutrition should consist of foods which are not very nourishing, such as vegetables, in particular those that cause warmth, such as onions and garlic and sea fish." Well, even though he says not very nourishing, vegetables, they don't have a lot of calories, so right on there. Their nutrition should also consist of things which strengthen without adding moisture, such as roasted meat from non-fat meats, and one should strengthen them by doing physical exercise with them as much as possible. So here we are 800 or so years ago, and it seems like we knew almost as much then about weight and weight problems and what to do about it as we know now, right? Because the typical advice is, well, you've got to eat better and exercise more, right? So what's going wrong here? Why are we seeing, we've known this for all this time, it's no secret to anybody, why are we seeing this epidemic, and especially in our children? And why aren't we doing better about it? This slide is to show you, just sort of as one example of how difficult this problem is, even though we seem to know all the answers. This is a review that a colleague and I did a few years back, although it hasn't changed a whole lot in the last few years. And this is when we looked at all of the school studies that have been done that were randomized trials to prevent cardiovascular disease. And we looked across all the different outcomes that they measured, because cardiovascular diseases include risk factors include smoking and a lack of inactivity and weight and all these things. And we looked across and saw how successful these studies were across the different studies. And what we found is that of those studies that included smoking as a target, there was about 80% success rate in being able to significantly impact smoking rates in kids. And from there on, it sort of went down. For physical fitness, you see it's about a third of kids in reported dietary intake. For studies that looked at blood lipid changes, it was down to about a third. But at the very bottom was adiposity or overweight, or weight changes. And that very few of these studies that had tried to reduce weight were successful at doing this. So what's going on here? We seem to have all the answers, and yet we don't seem very successful at controlling this. And in the meantime, over the last 30 years, we've seen this epidemic emerge. Well, the good news is we do have some success rates. A lot of it has actually occurred in our group here and other groups like ours. In fact, I think studies here at Stanford by colleagues and myself have accounted for about half of these successful results in school studies. And so what is it that we seem to be doing better than other people? And so I've tried to look at that, or maybe we're just lucky, but what is it that we can learn from what we've done and from these successful studies? I'm going to give you some examples of some of what we've done and give you an idea of where that's taking us in terms of what we think the best solutions are for reducing this obesity epidemic. Some of our work and some of what we're known for is our studies on television viewing in children, and in fact being able to reduce children's television viewing and then look at the outcomes of that. Now, television is related to weight in a couple ways, and probably all of these ways, but in terms of increasing the amount of food you take in, either because you're eating while watching and you're not regulating your intake very well, or because of the foods you see on TV and the advertising that's getting you to eat a different type of foods than you otherwise would eat, or decreasing, obviously, your activity. If you're sitting in front of television, you're not doing something more active. So this was a study in a couple schools in San Jose where we included all third and fourth grade children, and we matched the schools beforehand, and then we got the schools and they agreed to participate in the study, and then we chose one of the schools at random to receive a classroom intervention, a classroom curriculum we had developed to decrease television, videotape, and video game use, but without specifically promoting other activities as replacements. We wanted to study the effects of reducing television viewing alone, not the effects of an after-school program or some other substitute. And then the second school just was measured at the beginning and the end of a school year, along at the same time. We did measures of both the kids and also talked to the parents about their behaviors. What we found is over a single school year, just by introducing this curriculum to reduce their television viewing, and on this slide you see the group that's called the treatment group is the school that received the curriculum in red. The blue bar is the group that is the comparison group, and what you see is these are their changes in body mass index, or this BMI, over this 7-month period of time, over this basically a school year. And what we saw was that kids who received this curriculum to reduce their television viewing, and in that all the kids in that school, the third and fourth graders, gained about half as much weight or body fat, body mass index, as the kids in the comparison school over just a short period of time. And in fact, this was the largest change we had seen to this date in terms of effects on body mass index or weight and just from targeting television viewing, not from targeting physical activity or diet at all. Similarly, we measured their waist circumference and saw again about half as much of an increase in their waist size. And in fact, this difference here of almost 2.5 centimeters is almost an inch difference over 7 months in their waist size changes just from being exposed to a program to reduce their television viewing. So pretty remarkable, not even focusing on what we know are these things that Maimonides and others have identified for many centuries in terms of eating and activity. So obviously it had to work through those mechanisms. Now, why did that study tend to work and a lot of other studies don't, and why do some of our things work and not others? Well, I tend to attribute that to our focus on motivation. And that is two types of motivation. Motivation to want to change your behavior in the first place, which I think most of us have if we're worried about controlling our weight or we're worrying about helping kids control their weight. And that's this motivation to adopt a new behavior, to be more healthful. But the second is the motivation to participate in the intervention itself, is how do we motivate ourselves or help children or help families become motivated to want to do the things it takes to change that behavior. You know, what is it about physical activity and changing diet and changing sedentary behavior that are so difficult? And our focus has been on both these areas of motivation, whereas I think a lot of people have stopped at the first one, is that most of the work up to date and a lot of our public health messages are always about motivation to adopt the behavior in the first place. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. From the medical and public health perspective, the types of things we think about as motivators for physical activity and diet change are these things. Health concerns, because that's what we're worried about. You know, we see kids with diabetes, or we see kids with hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance, or high cholesterol, high blood pressure, their future risk of chronic disease. Those are the things that we worry about from our perspective. And so we tell you, it's really good for you. You need to change this because you need to for your health. Well, we all think that that's important, but it doesn't seem to be sufficient for us to change our behavior. And so when you try and put yourself in the place of what does change behavior for kids, and I think also for adults, you end up with lists like this. Well, fun and taste are very strong motivators, right, of our behavior. Challenge tends to be a strong motivator, and this comes from research on motivation in both children and adults. If you create challenges, that tends to be motivating. The perception that you have a choice. So if you give, many of you know this with your kids, if you give them a choice of behaviors, you may define those choices. So you may say, okay, it's bedtime. You can either brush your teeth or wash your face first. Or you can either, put on your pajamas or wash your face first, or brush your teeth first. Which do you want to do? They're more likely to want to do that if you offer them a choice than if you just tell them, okay, this is what you're going to do, this and this type of thing. So choice tends to be important in increasing motivation. Perception, similarly, of control, so that they feel like they have control over the decisions they make, and they get to choose and have some control over what's going on, even if we're defining the parameters of the external parameters with which they have to work with. They still have some control. Individualization, or the belief that the messages they're getting and that what they're doing is personalized, is for them alone. With kids, fantasy, and actually I think for adults too, but fantasy, or the belief that you turn something into a game, tends to be highly motivating, that you put it in the context of something else, an adventure. Social interaction is highly motivating for kids, so something that they can do where they're in a social situation. Pride and sense of accomplishment. Personal appearance, even though we avoid it a lot because a lot of us, especially in pediatrics, also have had experience with eating disorders, is that people sort of tiptoe around the personal appearance issue, but we know that that's a strong motivator for a lot of kids, that they will tell us that they feel better about themselves and think they look better when they lose weight, or they don't want to go into social situations because they feel overweight. They feel they're not attractive. Peer pressure or anticipated approval of what they can do. You know how strong that is in terms of kids choosing what they like because they've heard it's the right thing to do. They choose their fashions or their what they want to do for the summer. Now that people are getting their kids ready for summer activities, I want to do this because I've heard this is the best thing. They respond to that. Parent and adult approval, even teenagers, believe it or not, really want their parents' approval and want that attention. Very powerful. And then probably lowest on the list, but something that needs to be included, is material rewards. And those are the types of things in which we sort of bribe kids to do things. And they do work in the short term. They can have sort of backfire in the long run, so we don't want to necessarily depend on them, but it's part of what everyone uses, so it's worth at least mentioning. So thinking about these things and motivating kids and motivating families, I've started, and our group has started to look in another direction, started to think about our interventions and about programs in a different way. And we asked this question: does a health behavior change intervention need to look like health education? And that comes from looking at that list of motivators. Very few of them that really motivate behavior are related to knowledge or information about health, right? And this is what I've been terming stealth interventions. And that means that we think a little more broadly about what our interventions may be and how they may prevent weight gain and may increase activity and decrease intake, but by being stealth interventions, not focusing directly on those health issues. So I say that where health behaviors in a stealth intervention, for example, diet and activity change or obesity prevention, end up being a side effect of the intervention from the perspective of the person doing it. So they are not doing it because for health reasons. You may be designing it for that reason, but they're doing it, and a side effect of whatever they're doing tends to increase their activity or change their diet intake. And the ultimate of this approach is to try and identify target behaviors that are motivating in themselves, target behaviors that they would do whether they were good for them or not. So I'm going to give you some examples of things that we've been experimenting with. One of them that I think has been most successful is dance classes for girls. And the motivators for this are that it's fun. I'm almost never seen a pre-adolescent girl who doesn't start moving as soon as the music turns on, because it's just fun. They love doing it. It's natural. Being a part of a group and being part of a dance troupe. Having role models or mentors as young adult dance instructors who are goddesses to these girls in terms of looking up to them and being good role models. Challenge and self-improvement, and offers an opportunity for them to work on steps and work on their own improvement in what they do. We focus a lot on also teaching ethnic dance, because we find that the families find it highly motivating that their girls are learning about their ethnic culture and their ethnic background and the importance of dance. Almost every cultural group has dance as part of its history and part of its culture. And finally, one of the most motivating things is they get to perform. And even girls who don't feel that comfortable doing it, when their family's there and their friends are there and they're getting to perform, they get really excited about it. It turns out to be a very strong motivator. It also tends to be a motivator to get the parents involved. And we go to schools, for example, and it's hard as heck to get parents to show up at a back-to-school night, but you have a dance performance where their daughters are performing, and we average about 4 family members per girl who show up to these performances, and that can be on a Friday night in downtown Oakland. So a couple examples of using this approach that can show you how it's paid off. One is Dance for Health, which was a study that actually was put together by a Stanford medical student who was also a jazzercise aerobics instructor. And she organized this program where it involved 7th graders in East Palo Alto. And you can see the average age was about 12 and a half, mostly African American and Latino. And girls and boys were randomized to a 12-week program in which either they took their regular PE program or they had a hip-hop dance class taught by this medical student or one of her friends, or we had some other students doing it. And we didn't change the amount of PE. It was still 3 times a week and still 40 to 50 minutes. And it was the same as the regular PE, but they were just randomized to one or the other. Well, over this brief period of time, 12 weeks, we saw that girls, and here again the red group is the girls that got the Dance for Health program, and the blue group is the girls that didn't. Actually, I should start by saying we saw no effects in boys. And I don't know, at this age group, I think dance was probably not, it didn't work as well for boys because we had the boys and girls mixed maybe, and I think just by observation, it almost seemed cooler if the boys didn't dance as hard or didn't do things if they did. And I think that may be an age issue with this. But in the girls, we saw pretty dramatic changes over just 3 months, over 12 weeks, in which you can see by the red bar, girls who received the dance program for their PE actually didn't really change their body mass index at all, their body weight relative to their height. But girls who were in the regular PE continued to gain weight at a rate at their normal rate. And so we were able to slow that weight gain in girls just by offering a highly motivating activity during PE instead of the regular PE. We're doing similar types of programs for girls, but with an after-school program. And where, again, obesity prevention becomes the side effect because they're really doing it for all these other reasons. They're really involved in dance because they really love it, and it has all these other benefits. But the prevention, or the side effect is that they're being more active. They're also not in front of a TV in the refrigerator all afternoon if they're doing this, if they're in a dance class. So we do after-school dance programs, and one project is the Stanford GEMS project, which is with low-income African-American girls in Oakland, and we have 260 families involved in that, and we're teaching hip-hop, stepping, and African dance as part of that, and they also learn about their ethnic heritage. And the importance of dance in African culture. And the other project is Stanford Games, we call it, which is multi-ethnic girls in South San Francisco and Daly City in 6 elementary schools there, which are teaching hip-hop plus Latin American dance, Filipino dance, Asian dances, Pacific Island dances, and as well as African dance to sort of cover the spectrum. And we actually got feedback from girls that they wanted. We live in a very diverse part of the country here, and they wanted to learn the dances that their friends were doing and other things. So this was a positive. And we're doing this in that both these studies occur over a 2-year period of time. We did do a pilot study for Stanford GEMS before we started it, which again was a 3-month program, which we randomized girls to this dance program. These are the African American girls, and here was Oakland and East Palo Alto. And we randomized them. Only 61 families we had involved in this, randomized them to either dance plus a program to help them reduce their TV viewing, versus just giving them, the other group just got nutrition education. So I shouldn't say just nutrition education, a very intensive nutrition education program. And the idea was that these days we don't think it's appropriate to take a population with this epidemic going on and just give them nothing, be a total control group. And, or what would be called a control group or a placebo control. Instead, we give them something that we think is the state of the art and what the health department or what the school district would do if they have the resources to do it. And they do a whole nutrition education program where they're taught a lot of it based on 5 a day and other types of standard nutrition education. And what we saw is over just 12 weeks, we saw, again, about half as much of an increase, and here the red bars you see, about half as much of an increase in the girls that got the dance and TV intervention, TV reduction intervention, as compared to the girls who got health education. This is just to tell you, too, that we're trying to apply this as well to kids who are already overweight, because I know some of you are interested in members of your family or your children who may be struggling with weight now, is that we have a 6-month behavioral program for families in which kids and parents both participate, and we try and apply many of these same principles to that, even though it's much more directed because you have a group of people coming to you who say, I want to lose weight, or I'm here because I want to control my weight. So you can be, more directive, and health is still out there, as part of it, because that's why they're here, but at the same time to try and apply these principles to that setting as well, not just from a school setting and a public health or prevention setting, but also in a treatment setting. And this is about, I think, close to 200 of the recent participants. The blue bars are those kids who we're in English-speaking groups, the white bars in Spanish-speaking groups, and what you see is the scale on the left side is a change in percent overweight. And again, that's a measure in which we take their body mass index and adjust it for their age type of thing, because we expect kids to grow over time. So it's a weight adjusted for height type of measure. And what you see here, it didn't come out real well in terms of the axes, but what you see is the kids who have bars going up vertically are the group of kids who actually increased their weight during this 6-month period of time, which happens, and the kids going down decreased. And the ranges, the remarkable thing is by applying these principles, first of all, it's a 6-month program that meets weekly. About 85% complete the entire 6-month program, which is almost unheard of for any of these types of programs. In many programs, you have about a 50% dropout rate as early as the second visit or the second month. And the other thing is that about 85% of those who complete it actually do decrease their overweight, so decrease their weight adjusted for their height. And the average change is about 8% decrease in overweight, or a decrease from, say, if they were 50% overweight, they go to 42% overweight on average. But it ranges from kids who reduce their overweight by almost 40% to, on the other end, we've had kids who've gained 16% in overweight. And so we expect that to happen, but the vast majority of kids are actually reducing their overweight as part of this. And so it does apply to the weight control setting as well, not just the prevention setting. Okay. This is getting to the point where I, too, wanted to give you sort of a list of things that my guess is you're here to learn about things that you can do for yourselves or for in the community to help try and address this epidemic, because you may not have access to one of these programs or one of our research projects in which we're doing these programs. And what can you do that will make sense for your family and your community? And this is a list of what I would consider the top of my list of things that you can do yourselves. And so you can choose the ones that fit your family the best. So for families, improving the health of your family alone, first of all, in the food environment or the food side of things, the first thing is, if you have foods that you don't want your kids to eat, just keep them out of the house. I mean, that's the easiest thing. And it may not seem that easy because actually most of you are women in the crowd. Your husbands or the males in the family may want, have certain foods if you're doing the shopping that they want brought home or other things. But if the family is concerned about its weight, you or whoever does the shopping can really control what's in the house. If it's there, kids are going to eat it. Even if you tell them they shouldn't be eating it because it's junk food. If it's junk food, you can keep it out of the house. Fill your kitchen or wherever, or your home with fruits and vegetables, and make them easy to eat. This is an access type of issue. If kids come home from school, or kids are there, and there's a bowl of fresh fruits, or there's vegetables cut in the refrigerator, or whatever's around, that's what they'll eat. And they'll like it if it's there. They'll eat it. They may complain at first because it may not be what they're used to, but if you keep that food and give them access to it in those areas, we know that they're more likely to eat it and more likely to learn to like it over time. Another very important one, eat the foods you want your children to eat. You're the most important models for your children. So if you spit out your broccoli, or say, I'm not eating that because that tastes crappy, or whatever it is, and then, your kids are going to copy that. It's unfortunately, or fortunately, you're the best role model for your kids or your grandkids, or in terms of that. So what you eat is going to influence what they eat, especially if you show a positive attitude towards the foods that you want them to eat. Another part of that is try not to use food as a reward, especially don't use sweets to bribe children to eat their vegetables. What that ends up doing, and this comes back to that rewards thing I was talking about, but it actually increases the value of sweets to them and decreases their liking for vegetables, right, over time, because one's the reward and one's what you have to do to get there. And so we all probably use it, and we all bribe children with different rewards, and food is one of the easiest ones to do. But if you can help it, try not to use that because it can backfire over time. Controlling portion sizes, and it may involve you serving plates and not letting kids serve themselves, serving from, putting plates together from the kitchen or wherever before it's served, as opposed to family-style dining or something like that. Because, in fact, portion size does affect what we take in. So if you're served more food, you'll eat more food. And we know that from laboratory experiments. And in fact, that's one of the problems that we have with fast food and other things, is that the amount of food served is so large that, that you end up eating more. And so if you can control portion sizes, or another strategy for that is if you actually decrease the size of the plates so portions look larger, people will actually consume less, believe it or not. Because some of it is we eat what we're given in terms of that, and that affects how when we become satiated, when we become full. And another one is not eating in front of the TV. We know that in kids, on average, across a number of different populations, we've found, a number of different samples, we found that about 16% on weekdays, plus or minus, and about 25% of their calories on weekends are consumed in front of a television set, of their total daily calories. Kids are eating a lot in front of televisions. If we could stop just that amount of eating there, we may have an impact on, similar to reducing TV viewing, on their total calorie intake just a little bit. You only need a small change in that balance to create changes over time. The equivalent of a lifesaver a day, 10 calories of a day, for 365 days is about a pound a year. That's the energy balance difference. A lifesaver a day is about a pound a year. 140 calories, I think, is the calorie content of a regular soda, of a Coke or Pepsi. I think it's about 140 calories. That's a difference of 14 pounds a year. That energy difference is 14 pounds a year, just plus or minus one a day. Now, our bodies are a little more efficient than that, and they make up for calorie differences, so it probably doesn't translate exactly into that, but that's the energy difference that little amount of food makes. So small changes over time are very important. And limiting eating out for the same reason in terms of the portion sizes and having control, especially fast food, is you lose all control of what your kids eat if you're eating out of the house. And we tend to do that a lot these days, eating out because of the convenience, but at the same time, it's not like having control over the portions being served and also how food is prepared. It may be prepared with a lot more calories and fat than you would do it at home. How about on the other side, on the activity and inactivity side? Well, from our studies, I would say one of the most important things is limiting TV, videos, DVDs, video games, computer use, total screen time to somewhere less than about 7 to 14 hours per week. That's not a magic number. I tell most families that if you can cut it in half, that's a good goal to shoot for, no matter where you're starting. But the average child in this country spends probably more than 25 hours a week in front of a screen, based upon the self-reports we get and what's in the literature in terms of national surveys. And that's more than anyone, I think, would think that kids really need. I mean, some people, I don't feel that you have to throw out the TV totally. Some families do that. That's okay. But if you can reduce it, we know you'll see benefits from that. And the 7 to 14 hour per week goal is 1 to 2 hours per day. It has some meaning. It's something that kids can understand. The second thing is we know that 2/3 of kids have a TV in their bedroom, and including, most of the children of a lot of my colleagues here in pediatrics and other places. When you ask them, everybody these days seems to have a TV in their bedroom, the kids. Well, there's really not a reason to have that there. Well, the most remarkable thing, it's usually there to reward them for doing well in school, which sort of is kind of the opposite type of reward. It wouldn't make sense, because if there's anything that's going to decrease their studying time and other things, it's having that distraction in the room. But you lose all control, too, of what's going on in terms of kids watching TV. We've done studies with putting infrared cameras and videotapes in every room with a TV, multiple cameras, so we can see whether kids are watching, how much they're watching. We find kids are watching all night long, and their parents have no idea about it. The TV's on, or they're playing video games. We have kids we had one kid who was sitting in the closet the entire time watching TV for the whole night. We didn't know if he was sleeping or not, because we could only see his feet sticking out, but the TV was on the whole time. But that's the easiest way to to sort of help control the TV environment is just to not have a TV in the room. Be active with your children. If you want your kids to go out and be active, it's a lot easier if you do it with them too. So if you have family activities that are regular activities, where you're walking or walking to school, I have that too here as an option, is that there's nothing more that kids want than attention from their parents or adults. I mean, really, that's the strongest motivator at all. And whether it's positive attention or negative attention, right? I mean, if you get mad at them, it's almost as successful for them as if you're rewarding them or spending time with them. So anything that you can do or time that you can spend with them that's active can be very positive. So one of those things is walking them to school. If you're worried about safety and you don't want your kids to walk to school or bike to school because of safety, well, there's something, you can start a walking school bus in which a parent walks to school with the kids and supervises them, and you can carry a wagon with you to carry their 400-pound backpacks or whatever they're carrying these days to school, so that they're not having to do that. So you can come up with solutions to almost any excuse not to have kids at least get in a little bit of activity on the way to and from school. The other is after-school activities. Especially in this community and most communities around, we have a huge variety of activities that are occurring after school. Almost anything, even the studying activities, or some of them that we might think as inactive, are probably much more activity than they're getting than if they come home and sit in front of the TV. And so enrolling them in after-school activities besides being supervised and other things can be something that increases their activity levels compared to the alternative. And again, just small changes in energy balance can make a big difference over time. How about advocating for healthier schools, and what can you do in your community to try and advocate for healthier schools? Well, one of the things is pushing for nutritional standards for all foods and beverages that are either sold or served in schools. Not just the National School Lunch Program, which has standards, but what about the vending machines and a la carte foods and everything else that's sold. A lot of our schools selling foods, even fundraisers. There should be some nutritional standards for what is sold in schools, and that's something that you can push for as a parent, a community member, to try and make the schools more healthful. Also, if they're going to use a health curricula, as opposed to just being knowledge-based, having something that's behaviorally based, something that comes from research on what works in terms of changing behavior. And pushing for that in the school day. A third thing is promoting activity in school. And this is a tough one because the school day is being squeezed. But as advocates in your schools, you can promote this. In the recommendation from the Institute of Medicine, there's a large Institute of Medicine committee that came out with a report I was a member of in a response to a request from Congress for an action plan to prevent obesity in childhood. And one of the things was, can we get our schools to provide at least half of the recommended activity per day that is recommended for kids? Because they spend about half the school day or half the day in school, can we get them to at least get about half the recommended level of activity per day? And that doesn't necessarily just mean PE. It can be intramural or interscholastic sports programs, physical activity clubs or other programs, lessons that they can take in different activities. And including walking and biking to school programs like Walking School Bus. Another is trying to get your schools to be open for after-school use of facilities so that the schools become a community center. We know that kids are more active when they're outside than inside, or when they're outside the home, and so making that an opportunity for more activity at the school site. And finally, with schools, is I think something that I feel strongly about, and the committee itself came out in support of this, but knowing that it's a difficult goal, but making schools as advertising free as possible. It's amazing if you go into schools these days how much advertising and marketing kids are bombarded with. And a lot of it is for food or for sedentary pursuits, video games, other things like that. And so I think it's really important that we know what's going on in our schools, and that it's doesn't become a place that people can just market to children, because there's a lot of other things that are more important going on in schools. So schools are depending upon this advertising and other things because they like the book covers and they like the materials, but it comes with a price as well. So what about the broader community? What are things you can do in your community outside of the schools to try and help? Well, one is try and improve access to supermarkets, farmers markets, and community gardens. We do some programs, as I mentioned, in Oakland, and in West Oakland, there's really no access to supermarkets, so people can buy fresh fruits and vegetables. So there are a lot of efforts, and there's recently been some farmers markets open, a lot of efforts to really offer other alternatives. So, and it may be because you're trying to promote sustainable agriculture or local food, local farmers and things, but do things that can help increase the access to healthful foods in our communities. Street and sidewalk safety for walking and bicycling to school. We have an issue about safety. How can we address it by either putting traffic calming or other things with stop signs and crosswalks and crossing guards, the walking school bus, having parents supervise kids going to school. But these types of things allow and make it more likely that kids will then commute to school. And then finally, if you're politically minded, city planning practices in which you can increase the availability of opportunities for physical activity, so that when something comes through the zoning board or comes through the planning board in terms of developing a new area or putting a new building, talk about, well, what are the requirements for open space, and should we have parks there, and should we have places for kids to play? One of our pediatric residents has been working very hard to try and work with San Jose to develop an open field, an open lot into a soccer field for kids. If you could have that be part of the planning process, as opposed to just always being development, always going without necessarily having consideration of what the impacts may be on physical activity in the community. Finally, what can you do in terms of the healthcare community as well? And this is something that despite the fact that as a pediatrician I bring this up, and a lot of pediatricians are very concerned about weight with kids, they don't necessarily focus on this as part of your visit. So we depend a lot on parents to bring it up to us in some ways. And if your pediatrician or your family physician hasn't addressed this with you and addressed an issue, and you're worried about your child's weight, or even if you're not worried but think you want to bring it up and find out if your child has a weight issue or not, bring it up with them, because they'll respond to that. The other thing is, those of you who work for employers, most of us have insurance through our employers. Well, believe it or not, behavioral counseling and treatment for overweight, especially for children, isn't paid for until you get diabetes or something like that. Then it's paid for. But at this point, it's really we're not seeing a lot of movement, and people are waiting around until they get pressure from employers, really, to include this in medical plans. And we're working, and actually at the head of the curve has been a lot of the Medicaid in this state, Medi-Cal managed care plans are the ones that have been most forward in saying this is a problem and we need to deal with these. And that's something that at Packard Hospital we're working on that to try and get local health plans to cover these programs for kids, so that you have access to care if you need it. And last but not least, the healthy marketplace and media. What are things that you can try and do as a responsible citizen or as a responsible business person in the community too? One is that there are a lot of opportunities to create products that promote regular physical activity and reduce sedentary behaviors. I mean, we tend to have a very creative marketplace, and we can create products for almost anything. What can we do that will promote activity and reduce sedentary behavior, as opposed to the norm now, which is to create more and more activities and more products that seem to make our lives more sedentary? Similarly, how can we come up with more healthful options and point-of-purchase information at restaurants and other places to help people, make it easier for them to behave more healthfully? We make it awfully tough for you to eat a healthy diet, as if all you see is junk food and fat-laden, high-calorie foods in vending machines and in restaurants and all over. If we can create some options so that people have a better choice in terms of their to eat a more healthful diet. And finally, and this is a more general environment thing as well is guidelines. Can we push guidelines so that for advertising marketings of foods, beverages, and sedentary entertainment that are directed at children and youth, especially things like product placement, which is becoming the norm in video games and in children's television, in which they actually promote products within the content of the programming, as well as the way it's promoted, as well as the content of those programs. And there are a lot of people wanting to make a difference at different networks and other things who would like to see changes in this, and we can push them in that direction to do that. The other thing is the FTC has almost no authority to regulate advertising to children unless there's a specific complaint or there's something that they're doing which is untruthful. And it's sort of on an ad-by-ad basis type of thing. This is something that a lot of other cultures, in fact, a lot of other nations, in fact, some of the Northern European nations, in fact, so it's not just places that are, socialist or anti, sales or marketing, but have actually restricted marketing and advertising to children because they realize that it's really unfair to be trying to market to children because they don't understand the ads. They don't understand the concept of advertising well. And in fact, the American Psychological Association has come out with a recommendation that we not advertise at all to children under the age of 8 because they really don't understand the concept of advertising and they're too easily manipulated. Okay, so I would like to be able to answer questions and see if you have any particular questions you'd like to answer me. What we're doing here to give you an idea of a lot of our programs at Stanford and at Packard Children's Hospital is we have a comprehensive program called the Center for Healthy Weight, which is trying to tie together all of our clinical programs as well as our research, training and education programs, as well as a lot of advocacy and community programs under a single umbrella, and we're moving forward with that objective so that we have a comprehensive treatment of this program from community change and even advocating for legislation and policy change all the way up through working with individual kids. And Packard Children's Hospital is one of the few, actually only children's hospital in California that is even doing bariatric surgery in kids because there is a small number of children who actually have life-threatening complications of their weight where that's the only option, that weight loss surgery. And the other area in terms of getting resources and learning more about our programs is the Stanford Prevention Research Center, where we do a lot of adult programs as well as child programs, and that's where a lot of the research I've described. You can find out more about it in the programs we're doing, and these are 2 websites for those resources. So I thank you very much and am ready to take questions. The question was about what are the models, or are there models out there that have been successful in terms of behaviorally focused curricula, behaviorally focused programs to change for school curricula, right? And yes, in fact, a lot of our programs are based in social cognitive theory, which is probably the most popular model for behavior change interventions. And it focuses a lot, that's where a lot of our emphasis on motivation comes from. It also focuses on other, really 4 key principles, attention and having programs that people will attend to, retention or memory and phrasing things or putting things in a context in which it will be remembered, and there's a lot of ways that can be enhanced. Production, which is a rehearsal in which there's actually practice or an ability to turn thoughts into action, and I get feedback for that, as well as motivation, and those are the 4 key areas of that. But that model has really been the most successful when it's been applied with fidelity to curricula. A lot of the curricula out there now have focused mostly on knowledge and not on behavior, and that's been one of the issues. So, the things that have shown success are things that tend to focus or have been developed more with an eye towards these theories of behavior change. The question is what, and I'll make it more general, is how to deal with family members who really put a value on showing love through food some ways and being afraid to throw out food, or wanting to push people to clean their plate, things like that, or kids to clean their plate, and that. And it's because that's a very common situation, and especially it's one that often grandparents feel like, well, we're immune to this because this is how we want to spoil our grandchildren and stuff, and we don't want to deprive them of anything. Well, that's okay. But one thing is, if it is a concern again, going back to sort of the last answer, if it's a concern of the child, for example, and the child wants to do something about it, it's something that the child themselves or a parent can ask the grandparent, say, you know, we're really working on trying to control their weight, and they're really struggling with it. Is there something that you can do to help us with this? I mean, can you help us do this? Because sometimes I know it's really tough, and you really don't want to deny your grandchild of anything, but this is very important to him or her, and it's important to me. And is there something that can we garner your support for doing this, and can you help us do this? And again, by inviting people in to be part of the process, it makes it a lot easier, because then you're contributing to the happiness of your child or your grandchild, as opposed to feeling like you're fighting with your daughter or your daughter-in-law or whatever it is, in terms of family members, in terms of, you know, you, one person cutting down on food portion sizes, the other one increasing them and stuff. But basically, it's a lot of it comes from, especially in past generations, is there was more sensitivity to hunger and not having enough. And it's we live in a society now in which, for most families, not all, because there's still hunger in this country, but for many families, we have a really high availability of food, and calories are extremely cheap. They're extremely inexpensive. And as a result, we tend to be sort of overcompensating for it. So all I can say is that we know that there's nothing more important, like there's nothing more than kids than attention from their parents or grandparents or adults. There's often nothing more important to a grandparent than their welfare of their grandchild. And so if they can be brought into that process of helping the child do something for themselves, as opposed to sort of having it be a punishment or imposing it on it, then it can be a lot easier, and it becomes something that the whole family works with together on, as opposed to something that where there's conflict. And we do see conflict build as changes occur in families. You know, when we tried to reduce television viewing initially in some of the work we did, it was the fathers who objected, you know, often. And it was like, you're not taking away my television, you know, for this. Or, you know, not all fathers. I'm not it's not totally sexist comment, but it's you know, and we have for a lot of things, food carries a lot of meaning in a lot of families, and so of course it's going to bring up emotion, and it's going to bring up feelings and maybe history and stuff. So it's a process in which you work on it, and everyone works together, as opposed to being, you know, working at odds with each other. The question was about what about a child in a family that is genetically prone to being overweight, where the parents are overweight or the mother's overweight and the grandparents are overweight on, you know, on one side of the family or another or both. And this is a common situation that we see. The genetics are obviously important in terms of making us prone to gaining weight, making us more susceptible. But regardless of what your genes are, and regardless of what your metabolism and your biology, that law of thermodynamics still holds, that if you burn more calories than you take in, you're going to lose weight. If you take in more calories than you burn, you're going to gain weight. And it may be that it makes it harder if someone has genes that make them more likely to gain weight. It may make them harder, may make it harder for them to control their weight, but there's still that balance that occurs. And you still have to take in more than you're burning to be able to gain weight. So yeah, there's a lot of hope, and the solution's the same regardless of whether you have a family that's prone to obesity or not. And I would also say too that even if the suspicion is that there's a strong genetic component. It's probably less than 1%, maybe far less than 1% of overweight kids who actually have something that we can identify in their genes or their biology that's making them prone to being overweight. The vast majority is due to things and behaviors that occur that also run in families, in addition to genes, that become habits over time, and environments in which we live in, too, that sort of promote that. So those are the things we can change. At this point, except in a certain very small number of cases, we can't really change the genes, and that's something else that people are working on here at Stanford. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for that to be possible, or the way those genes even work, we can change our behaviors and change the environment in a way that makes it easier. So yes, there's lots of hope, and the same type of principles I talked about in terms of prevention and treatment and these behaviors apply to everyone, regardless of their genes. The question is whether, again, in general terms, summarizing it, is whether, because there seem to be fewer resources available for teens, if there is any different advice or any different approaches that should be applied for teens as opposed to younger children. And I would say the same principles apply, but they're going to be applied differently because the kids have different things that may motivate them. So something such as the dance programs we do may be very popular among teen girls, maybe among some groups of teen boys. In fact, we know that I've talked with some groups that do ethnic dance in San Jose, for example, in the Vietnamese or Laotian communities, Cambodian communities, where it's a very popular form of social interaction for families and for the kids. That may be something that you can get kids interested in, again, a stealth intervention, right? It's not, they're going to do it because it's fun and they enjoy it, not because it's good for them or to control their weight. Things like that. In San Jose, it's known for its swimming resources and other things, and the Santa Clara community in terms of that. And in the summer, that can be something, get kids into swim programs or other things. Making other after-school activities available to them so they're not hanging out at the mall or in front of the TV. And so thinking about and opening up to them about what they'd like to do. Almost anything is better than sitting home in front of the TV and the refrigerator all afternoon. So those are the types of things, and especially on the activity side, it's almost easier for them than the food side to find things that they will want to do. However, things like the community action type of approach and activism, what's gone on with smoking and getting kids active about saying we want to try and help reduce smoking in our community and among teens, they can become activists around food. And I know you said you work for a school district, so this may not be a desirable answer for you, but kids can get active around what's provided in the school meals and what's provided at schools. The question was about what the research is on gardening and cooking classes and whether that would be an approach, a promising approach, and I think it really is a promising approach. I would love to be able to study it more systematically to see what's working, what isn't, whether kids are being attracted to it, who would be doing it otherwise or not, and a lot of those issues in terms of who joins these programs is big. But if we offer enough opportunities around, say, gardening and cooking classes and things like that, then kids will migrate to the things that appeal to them, and teenagers especially. Question being whether, in particular, the French have a lot of policies that differ from ours in terms of the way we treat children from birth on, from pregnancy on, and whether they might apply to this country and what we can learn from their experiences. And I think one thing you point out is that a lot of European countries, and in fact a lot of the world, have much more developed public health infrastructures than we have, and programs, and they actually have healthcare systems as opposed to our system here in this country. And so as a result, they do have a lot more programs, and especially a lot of the European countries have a lot of programs that actually work with families and from prior to birth on through childhood. Whether that can be given credit for their lagging rates of weight or not, or some of those policies, it's impossible to know. Europe is seeing the same type of explosion in overweight as the rest of the world, and even the northern European countries, which prided themselves in being fit. You know, the Norwegians and the Scandinavians are it's very athleticism is a very big part of their culture and athletics, and they're starting to see the rates of childhood obesity paralleling, you know, that ours. They're starting a lot later and further down, but the whole world seems to be going up at a similar rapid pace, and that's kind of scary. And so I think we do have a lot we could learn from other countries in terms of a lot of their policies around children's health and respect for mothers and children. But at the same time, it's tough to know which policies in particular might have or might contribute to controlling weight. I sort of say it's, from my point of view, it's what we do is sort of solution-oriented research, in that I'm less concerned about what got us here to this point, because the world's a different place, and I'm less concerned about comparing. You know, we get a lot of ideas from looking at what we think was related to the obesity epidemic and what is occurring in other countries, but that where we really need work is in applying those good ideas and testing them to see what works here and now, because we live in a whole different world than we did 30 years ago when this started. And it may be that there are different factors, such as no one's going to, you know, the community garden issue and gardening, getting kids involved in gardens. You know, no one's going to say that the obesity epidemic was caused by the fact that we don't have urban gardens. You know, no one's going to put that into their model to try and figure out what caused the obesity epidemic. But at the same time, that might be a solution, one of the solutions that we could benefit from. And so it doesn't have to necessarily be documented as one of the causes to be considered as one of the potential solutions, if it is consistent with everything else we know around it. The question is it possible to have a child who's too skinny, too fat? Well, we use the same growth charts that I showed you, the same growth charts for looking at weight for overweight as we do for underweight. And the best thing is to when you see your pediatrician or family physician or nurse practitioner, to ask them where they plot out in terms of their body mass index. And they can be too thin, or they can be too heavy, or they can be somewhere in the middle. And there is a problem with undernutrition or being too skinny, although these days it's being dwarfed a lot by what we're seeing in overweight in kids. My guess is now, because so much of the population is becoming overweight, that what we're seeing as skinny isn't as skinny as it used to be. Yeah, right, except in models, and there is still a clear problem, and we know that kids who are overweight are more likely to develop disordered eating behaviors, and so that's one of the risks. Are we going to see increases in eating disorders as well in girls and boys? And because it's setting kids up to do that, and not necessarily because there's all these messages about not eating, but if you're overweight, you're at higher risk. You see, when we look at national data of kids' weights and their parents' or their mother's beliefs about whether they're underweight, normal weight, or the right weight, underweight, the right weight, or overweight, pardon me, we find that even kids who are defined as overweight, only about 40% of their mothers would say that they are overweight. And the rest, 60%, say that they're either the right weight, or some of them say that they're underweight. And so our perceptions have probably changed as well as what constitutes overweight, and styles have changed with it. I mean, it's, the baggy clothes, for boys especially, and teenagers and stuff, and things. And we see kids, and unless you're thinking about this problem all the time, like like we are, when you see a child, they may look like they fit in with everybody else, but it may be that the whole group is overweight because our whole population has gotten so much heavier. Okay, thank you very much.
The preceding program was brought to you by Stanford on iTunes U and is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at itunes.stanford.edu.